Africa, despite being humanity's origin point, has suffered much the last couple of thousand years, whether it be from the Arabic slave trade, the European triangle trade, or the carving up of Africa into various territories. It has not been a place without conflict nor suffering, forever used by either outsiders or its domestically produced dictators. Historically speaking, there has been two different types of colonialism in Africa. Firstly, there has been the various trade posts and small settler colonies along with coastal forts along the Ottoman rule in northeastern Africa, with the majority of Africa being under the control of native states. This situation was quite profitable and began during the 15th century, through small coastal trade posts, fortresses, and naval control. They could buy and sell with the Africans that were desperate for weapons in the new arms race against their neighboring countries, which they would then use to enslave their neighbors and sell for weapons. Rinse and repeat. Through various diplomatic schemes, European empires could gain access to a lot of local resources and minerals through protectorates, trades, and their work as kingmakers. This was the case until King Leopold II of Belgium claimed all of Congo as his own personal territory, not of Belgium, but of King Leopold. This caused a scramble for Africa, as leaders patched up Africa for prestige and to ensure it didn't fall into rival hands. Soon enough, a conference was called and the whole continent was divided. In the 30 years following 1880, European powers conquered almost the entire continent, with only Ethiopia and Liberia retaining full independence. This was quite a rapid change and brings forth the questions: what if this never happened? What if the scramble for Africa never happened and good old colonialism never changed? One of the biggest departures for this to happen would be a seemingly insignificant event, namely that of King Leopold II of Belgium dying before colonizing the Congo. Thus, no Belgian Congo provided motivation for the other powers to want their own chunks of the continent. Second of all, the British Empire loses the war against the Zulu Kingdom. This war was only narrowly won by the British in our timeline, so making the British lose is not too difficult, and it was more done by the local government than the British government. The local government kind of received post-facto authorization to do it, but that happened because they won. If they lost the war, local government would have come under heavy criticism from the British government since they made such a disastrous decision. The attempted colonization of the Zulu Kingdom would probably be viewed as a debacle that future British politicians would not want to be associated with, making the chances of a round two less likely. A combination of no Belgian Congo and the debacle with the Zulu War would make most British politicians view trying to colonize Africa as being non-beneficial, not having a geopolitical incentive in European politics, and being quite costly. With both Belgium and the British out of the picture in Africa, the Berlin Conference never happened, and neither does the Scramble for Africa. Neither does the need for Germany and other powers to keep up with those colonial powers. The result will be that instead of colonies, there will be friendly regimes and kingdoms that in order for the European powers and USA to extract resources. If this occurs, you get protectorates and vassal kingdoms along the coast who with European weapons conquer inland for resources that are then traded for European weapons and manufacture goods. So pretty much the slave trade, but rubber and ivory instead of just slaves. So a continuation of the historical. The continuation of what happened before into a continual future. Africa in this timeline has a very different history of continuous independence instead of colonization and rapid decolonization. If you look at this map, you'll see a cropped version to the left that shows all the uncolonized areas of Africa that would be greatly different during this timeline, or about 90% land-wise. Of course, a lot of that is desert and uninhabitable, but there's still a lot that would change. Everything, to be precise. Africa, even in our timeline, is a place of great differences. It's a wonderful place of great riches and skyscrapers. And it's a place of impoverished illiterates, the most extreme continent in the world. Africa is a place with a North African divide, a Sub-Saharan divide, a East, West and South divide, and a Central divide. It has endless tribal identities, but also national to some extent. There are wealthy city-states, there are petrostates and sectarian divisions. And there are also tribes that are living with what could be described as quite primitive technology. Africa in this timeline would be even more divided in many ways, but would also be more native grown, with most of its own institutions and government structures, with influences from the powers that sponsors them. In a world where Europe invested much less resources in Africa and with less European settlers going there, with fewer colonies in sub-Saharan Africa beyond South Africa. In a world like this, I reckon you would see a lot of tribal confederates and wars between countries, rather than the civil wars you see in modern Africa. With the arms sold, they could sell their neighbors' people for cash easily. I reckon we would see the slave trade continue longer for this reason, as there are no European powers there to stamp out the slave trade once abolitionism picks up steam. Some places would clearly do better today, like for example Congo, would suffer greatly under Belgian colonialism, whereas I reckon places like Sahara Desert regions would be doing worse and fall victims to ruthless expansion from neighboring countries. I say this because these places is historically were the last places to have slavery abolished. In general, coastal nations would be doing better, have more varied infrastructure, instead of the extraction infrastructure they have in our timeline. But the more inland countries, the more inland regions, the less developed these places would be, and the more exposed they would be to exploitation from their own native countries. Central Africa would be more stable. Somalia would probably do better as they form naturally instead of the strange Somali place, Somaliland, within a failed state Somalia in our timeline. Sudan would likely be part of Egypt, at least northern Sudan, or what's today called Sudan. There would be a ton of small countries. They would look more squiggly, follow natural barriers, rivers, mountains, and defensible lines, as well as ethnic lines. We also would unfortunately have a lot less Christian Africa, with much more tribal religions and traditional religions. And the spread of French and English would be much weaker. As for Europe, European countries conquered their colonies, expecting political rather than economic benefits. And the conquest of Africa was in many ways a European arms race, where different countries took land mostly in order to deny land from each other. Colonial rivalry was a key cause of the First World War, as colonial rivalry led to strained relations among the European powers, and colonial rivalry led indirectly to the formation and strengthening of alliances and ententes. Italy turned to Germany and Austria when she lost Tunisia to France in 1881. As France and the UK expanded their empires, it resulted in increased tensions, with Germany who felt the need to keep up, lest they be left behind. Famously, Bismarck didn't even want colonies, but he felt pressured by the public to get those. A non-colonial Africa should keep Europe more peaceful in general, at least temporarily. Beyond that, economically speaking, the influence of the African colonial empires on their metropoles' economies was complex, since while they cost real money in conquering and administrating, they could bring profits in various forms, resources, profits from investments, and as export markets. However, while the classic narrative is that Europe made a lot of money from Africa, the opposite is also true. They costed, and all of them weren't profitable. Some, like Togo and South Africa, already had social and economic structures that allowed for their integration into industrialized, globalized imperial economies. Others, like the Congo, had to be insanely brutalized in order to even make barely any profits. This is in contrast to colonies in the Caribbean and Asia, where sugar plants and the like brought great profits, as they were home to the sugar islands, tropical islands, that had been extensively transformed through plantations and slavery to produce massive quantities of sugar for their metropoles. Nowhere in sub-Saharan Africa, except perhaps in British South Africa, were the Europeans able to transform local economies so deeply and efficiently. And as a result, their empires there remain largely disconnected from their economy's real momentum. So you could say in many ways they were money dumps and subsidized outdated industries instead of newer industries, and exacerbated economic inequalities as the profit went to individuals, while commoners often paid the taxes which paid the cost for these endeavors. So let's talk a little bit about some specific places in Africa and the differences. Take for example Morocco. Morocco would change quite a bit. Facing less containment than neighboring countries, would be one of the sole African power brokers in northwestern Africa, conquering much land that would seem useless for much of history until some of its oil fields became available. It also stayed largely uninvolved in any world war and benefit some from trade in the region. Melilla and Ceuta is a constant form in Spanish relations, but as Morocco is never forced to wrestle for its independence, there are never the same counter-reactionary movement against what was seen as European, and the subsequent push for Arabization, which makes it so that the Berber language stays a vibrant part of certain bits of Morocco. Ethiopia would be another country that changed quite a bit. With a lot of the Orthodox influences, they would be quite a powerful ally potentially for the Europeans. And they could serve as a counterbalance even more for the Ottomans. With less European colonialism standing in the way, they could potentially be allowed to expand freely, taking much of Somalia and Eritrea, and they could be quite a powerful defender of the faith and a sponsor of the Coptic people across Africa. They could also potentially be one of those countries which the Europeans may take Sudan and parts of southern Egypt, depending on how things develop. All in all, what do you guys think? It's hard to predict what it would be like, but I tried to give some insight into what could have been. Thanks for watching my video, and please like and subscribe. Bye.